And say welcome to everybody. Welcome to number 132 of the Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk series. Today's topic is Exploding the Myths of Natural Wine with Simon Woolf. I'd like to extend a welcome to those of you joining the first time and also to our non-members. Just a bit of background information. The Circle of Wine Writers was founded in 1960 in the UK. Today we have over 270 members, including wine writers, educators, broadcasters, and other professional communicators. The membership is now 50-50, split between the UK and overseas. There's more information about the Circle on our website and also details there about how you can join online. I'd like to now hand over to Helen Savage, a committee member who's in charge of now running these events, who will introduce our speaker. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Andrea, very much indeed. I'm thrilled to be able to welcome Simon and you all this evening. And I am anticipating a lot of fascinating discussion tonight. It's a hot topic, isn't it? But Simon is the real authority that we need to help guide us through it. He has written a Louis Roederer Wine Award winning book, The Amber Evolution, How the World Learned to Love Orange Wines. And I've just heard that a third edition of that will be published next year. It's a scene that is changing fast, as we shall learn. You also need to know that Simon has a quite remarkably fine site, The Morning Claret, which is a Substack production. If you haven't looked at that, please do. It's really excellent. And he has a second book, also award-winning, Foot Trodden, but that's on a slightly different subject. As far as natural wine and orange wine and all of that goes, as Simon says in his notes, it's a really quite contentious subject, with some people contending that its popularity will keep growing and others saying that its day has been and gone. Just anecdotally, here in France, I'm aware of quite a number of growers who are still adding natural and orange wines to their list and insisting that it isn't a predictable audience who enjoys them. And yet I also want to say, perhaps to the shame of some of you who are here, that when I helped to take a tour to Alsace last year of AWE members, when we went to one producer who is now entirely to do with natural and orange wines, there were puzzled looks all around the room as people tasted his wines. It is a contentious subject. Simon, please guide us through it.
Thanks very much, Helen, and thank you so much to everyone for taking the time. Let me just quickly try and share some slides with you. This is something that Zoom has just made more difficult for me in the latest update, but we're going to do our best here. Okay. That's not at the beginning. Wait. Yeah, that's fine. Can you all see my screen now?
Yep, looks good, thank you.
Yeah, I'll never forget doing about the first 20 minutes of a webinar for the Wine Scholar Guild a couple of years ago, and it wasn't until 20 minutes in when someone said, we know we can't see beyond your first slide. Something had gone wrong. Okay. So yeah, as Helen said, I think the term natural wine in particular can be quite divisive, which is something that I think is a pity. I mean, I'm definitely a card-carrying natural wine fan. I think it's a movement that, and a philosophy, if you like, that has massively enriched my drinking over the last 15 years, which is about the extent that I've been aware of natural wine. So I'm always keen to try and explode the myths, or to try and work out why this term gets people's backs up, and what can we do about it. So what I'm going to talk about is, I want to get straight down to it and talk about definitions, because I know this is the biggest problem. A lot of people think that it's a a vague term that doesn't have any legal meaning, and that's where the problems start. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk a little bit about the origins of this movement. Where did it come from? Why did it start? And why did it take shape in the way that it has? Why is it contentious? There's some specific reasons that I think we can talk about. And also, maybe it sounds obvious, I'm not going to talk a lot about terroir and things like that, but I would like to talk about why wine made in a natural way, whatever that means, may taste so different. You know, what are we really talking about here? What are the points of difference? We do need to talk about faults as well. It's such a hot potato. I have a little bit of information in my slides about some particularly iconic producers and some wines that people can seek out if you're wanting to go exploring. I don't know if I'll have time for that, but we'll see how we do. Let's get to the definition. I mean, I'll first talk about the way that I use the term myself. And for me, this little phrase, natural wine, it's just a handy kind of code word in a way. It's something that I can say to someone when I walk into a wine shop or I walk into a restaurant and I meet a sommelier that I don't know. I can say to them, have you got something a little bit more on the natural side, you know, because that's what I like to drink. And for me, that's code for give me a wine that was made with a spontaneous fermentation, no selected yeasts. Give me a wine that was unfiltered or very lightly filtered. Give me a wine that's had the minimum possible done to it in terms of processing and intervention. Give me a wine with very low or no added sulfites. So it's a way of saying all of those things in just 2 words, and 9 times out of 10 everybody knows what you mean, and it works, and it's a kind of useful shortcut in my opinion. But if we were going to dig into that a little deeper and try to nail this down, what does it mean? I want to start with some quotes. Isabelle Legeron, who's France's first female master of wine. Yeah, I'm sure many of you will know her. She founded the massively successful raw wine fairs that now take place on, I think, 3 or even 4 continents every year. And she has the simplest possible definition. She sometimes just talks about natural wine as living wine. And I'm going to explain why she uses that phrase a bit later. I also like to quote the maverick Belgian winemaker Frank Cornelissen, who makes wine in the Etna region of Sicily. Many years ago, everyone used to say, people used to say, oh, well, Cornelissen makes natural wines. And he said, I don't make natural wines, I just make wine with nothing added. And that was his point of view. Slightly longer definition from the Raw Wine website, which I think says quite a lot. Natural wine is farmed organically or biodynamically and made or other transformed without adding or removing anything in the cellar. So I think we can see already there's a lot of focus here on what you don't do and what you don't add. There is a bit of an elephant in the room here that I want to try and tackle. We're all used to use this phrase natural wine, which is an English phrase. I think this phrase actually came out of a mistranslation of a French phrase, because the French phrase vin nature is probably the sort of term that crystallized around this movement somewhere around the late 80s, early 90s. And any of you who speak French will know that the correct English translation of vin nature is not natural wine. That's a false friend. The word nature in French means without additives or plain. The classic usage being yogurt nature, meaning a yogurt with no fruit, no sugar, just plain yogurt. So if we were to translate this important phrase correctly, then we wouldn't get natural wine. We would get wine without additives. I think this mistranslation has maybe caused immeasurable amounts of pain and suffering to people, but that's where we are. The terminology, nomenclature has a life of its own. You can't change it. But I think this is just something. It's just something interesting to think about. What if we had the correct translation of this pre-existing French phrase? let's move on to what this whole idea of wine without additives actually means. I think, you know, we're all wine professionals. I don't want to patronize anyone, but I think if we talk about consumers, the average wine drinker, most of them have this romantic idea in their head about how wine is made. And sad to say, even some professionals, I think, tend to romanticize this. And it goes something like this. You start with grapes, you put them in something, a barrel, a tank, whatever it is, you let them ferment for a certain amount of time, you have wine. It's a lovely romantic idea. You know, and I know, for 90% of wine made today, maybe even 95%, this is not how it's made at all. This is how wine is made in the 21st century. I'm not saying all wine, but I'm saying about 95%. So again, I don't want to tell you all things that you already know, but I think it's important to restate this. You know, most wine, especially when we're talking mass-produced wine that is sold in a supermarket or in any large retail chain, will be produced with the addition of a lab yeast, enzymes, yeast foods, or whatever it takes to get the fermentation going as fast as possible. It may well be chaptalized, still surprisingly common even in our globally heating world. It may well be acidified if there wasn't enough natural acidity. There may be additional enzymes that we're going to add if we want malolactic to happen really fast, or we don't want it to happen, then we'll add more stuff to make that happen. Obviously lots of filtering, sterile filtering maybe if the supermarket demands it, which they often do. Fining with a fining agent. So there's a lot going on here, and I've only scratched the surface. You know, there are, I think, around 75, 77 permitted additives in wine in the EU. And these are all of the ones that I was able to fit on a slide at a typeface that you could still read. The interesting thing is as well, we have new wine labelling laws as of the 2024 vintage that are supposed to make it much more transparent. So if you're the kind of person that cares about how much intervention there's been in your wine, or you care about what may have been added or not, you'd think you'd be able to see that on the label. Unfortunately, that's not the case, because probably at least half the stuff listed on this slide isn't considered to remain in the finished wine. So things like selected yeasts, fining agents that are not allergens, still don't need to appear on the label. So I think we have to remember, you know, this is the backdrop for how the natural wine movement developed. Wine in the modern era has become a very technological product. It's become quite an industrialized product, and it's moved a long way away from this lovely idea that wine could just be made from grapes. I wanted to kind of put meat on the bones of this because, you know, I can sort of already hear people saying, well, you know, nobody uses all that rubbish anymore. You know, most wine is actually made in a very artisanal way in the 21st century. No, it's not. No, it's not. This is from the Tesco website. I love Tesco to bits because they put full ingredients lists for all their wines on their site. It's not required. Of course, you are required to have the QR code on the wine label, but Tesco puts them on the site, which is super interesting. And what I find interesting is that you can have a look at some quite premium wines, and it's quite shocking to see how much went on to confect those wines. You know, there's nothing really very artisanal or natural about them. So just some examples here. I love the example of this Waro Cove Sauvignon Blanc. I don't know what's going on here, but they somehow, if I understand this correctly, had to chaptalize and acidify. So that's an interesting combination. I came up against a few wines that are made with a stabilizer that I don't know much about, which is the carboxymethylcellulose. I know nothing about this stabilizer, but it seems to have become quite popular because I found 3 wines in quick succession that all use it as a stabilizer, along with the more usual sulfur dioxide. We seem to have an Albarino here that didn't have enough natural acidity, which I don't know what you're doing wrong in Rias Baxus if you can't get acidity. But so, you know, the point I'm making here is that we have to accept that most wine is made with lots of additives, lots of intervention, most wine is an industrialized, mass-produced product. Let's set that against where this whole idea of vin nature, or wine without additives, came from. And for this, we need to step back to Beaujolais in the late 1970s, and we're going to meet these two gentlemen, Jules Chauvet and Jacques Neupoort. Jules Chauvet was a trained chemist. He's famous for a number of things. He's actually famous for inventing the ISO tasting glass. He's also famous for having published a number of treatises in the 1950s, where he suggested the modern way of writing a tasting note. He suggested these ideas that actually when you taste the wine, you shouldn't describe it with emotions, or you shouldn't describe the texture, but you should describe it by comparing it to very precise fruits or vegetables or flowers or whatever might be relevant. So he's been hugely influential, but he's also one of the first people who started to seriously research the idea of spontaneous fermentation in the modern age, so fermenting without adding selected yeasts. The reason that Chauvet and Neupoort were so interested in this is because they looked at the state of winemaking in Beaujolais in the 1970s, and they were really saddened. You know, they felt that the wines from Beaujolais had become cheapened, they'd become industrialized. By the end of the 70s, you had over-chaptalization, over-sulfiting. You had these kind of rather nasty sort of bubblegummy confections. And I think, we can probably all remember when Beaujolais Nouveau was really the only exciting thing you could say about Beaujolais. This is before the revival of the Beaujolais Cru. So Chauvet and Neupoort thought it doesn't have to be like this. If you start with healthy grapes, if you start with grapes that haven't been sprayed to death with chemicals and synthetic products, then there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to have a nice clean fermentation just by letting the grapes ferment on their own. And there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that in the right conditions without massive use of sulfites. So that was Chauvet's research, really. That those were his key points, refining how to get the best and cleanest natural fermentation, spontaneous fermentation, and refining how to go about that using the minimum or even no added sulfites. And Jacques Neupoort, I guess, was a kind of the middleman, really, who took all this learning and took these ideas and went to a now famous bunch of winemakers in Beaujolais and said, "Hey guys, did you know, maybe, you can implement some of this and your wines are going to be, a little bit more interesting, a little bit more terroir, sense of place than they would be otherwise." So this is really where the movement in France started, and we're into the 1980s now. Obviously, these names, Lapierre, Bertrand Foillard, Métrasse, Thévenet, they're extremely famous names now, but they were just young winemakers back in the day. I think what we can kind of trace how the natural wine movement developed from here on in. Anyone who maybe spent a lot of time in Paris in the 1990s, you'll probably remember there were these places called Cave à vin nature or Cave à vin sans sucre that started cropping up. And these were the two terms that people got behind right at the beginning, I think. So they were talking about, vin nature, not natural wine, wine without additives. And they were talking about vin sans sucre, which is is a slightly incorrect way of saying wine without sulfites, sorry. So this is kind of where something like a movement started to coalesce. And obviously what we saw from the late 90s, early 2000s and on, it quickly began to broaden. These ideas were taken up all over Europe. I don't think it's fair to say that natural wine as a thing, or vin nature, only started in France. I think there were pioneers all over Europe, probably all over the world. There were pockets of winemakers having the same thoughts, having the thoughts that it's sad that wine has become so industrialized, so technology-driven, such a mass-produced product. It doesn't have to be like this. So this was a kind of reaction, if you like, against where we'd got to by the 70s, by the 80s. And you see it sort of taking off around Europe. And then what you start to see is by the beginning of the 21st century, there are wine fairs happening all over the place. There are specialist wine fairs. These are events like La Dive Bouteille that started off very grassroots, very kind of underground sort of radical events in a way. And then they gradually broadened and became more popular. And you fast forward to the 2020s, and we now have a global movement. It's like a whole ecosystem. There are specialist wine fairs, there are specialist importers, specialist retailers, you name it. I think what's interesting to me is that the natural wine movement it's not just broadened in its popularity, it's also broadened in its scope. Because, if you go back to this work that Chauvet and Neuport were doing, it had a narrow scope. They were just trying to experiment in a scientific way to figure out the best possible conditions for doing stable, clean fermentations without adding yeast, enzymes, sulfites. That was their focus. It's massively broadened now, and I think it's broadened into a kind of overarching philosophy about doing less. Quite rightfully, I think there's a huge amount of emphasis on the farming as well. Let's talk about that briefly. I think, as I said before, the idea of farming without chemicals has always been very much front and center when we talk about making wine without additives. And there are very clear reasons for that. And I think reason number one is that if you are spraying systemic products, if you're spraying synthetic products, pesticides, insecticides, fungicides on your vineyards, you are going to compromise the indigenous yeast populations in the vineyard and on the grape skins. So you're minimizing or lessening your chances of being able to do a reliable and healthy spontaneous fermentation. So this is one of the clear reasons why natural wine really has to start at minimum with organically farmed grapes. Of course, we can get into lots of other stuff like, pesticide residues on grape skins and things like that. But I think in general, it's a mindset thing. It's a philosophical thing. The philosophy of wanting to make wine in this more purist, back to the roots way, spurning the additives and the technology that became popular after the Second World War, goes hand in hand with the philosophy of not embracing the chemical era in the vineyard, of not using synthetic products just because we can. Obviously, the farming landscape today is quite broad, and I made a little Venn diagram to try and illustrate this. And the biggest part by far, it's far bigger than I've shown it on this slide, is still conventional farming. I think regenerative farming is interesting. That's quite a new philosophy. That I think it has a certain amount of overlap with organic farming, but this is contended. I think it's very interesting because regenerative farming, obviously we're talking about rebuilding soil health. We're talking about trying to reduce the amount of work that you do on your land, reduce the amount of ploughing, reduce the amount of tillage, building biodiversity, so welcoming other things back into the vineyard that aren't just vines. This is a hugely useful set of ideas. There are some people who would say that it has to go hand in hand with working organically, that there's no way you can be working regeneratively if you're still spraying chemicals in the vineyard. That's contentious, so I'm not going to get into it. All I want to show you here is that the worlds of organic farming and regenerative farming overlap quite considerably. Then we have this much smaller biodynamic sector where I think you have much more of a kind of philosophical or even esoteric element, working with the phases of the moon, a huge focus on soil health. What's relevant here when we talk about natural wine is, I think, we cannot talk about any concept of natural winemaking if we are on the left-hand side of this slide. If you're working with conventional viticulture using systemic products, ergo, you're not making wine. You cannot make wine without additives because you started with the additives in the vineyard and you've already destroyed a lot of what you need to have a healthy fermentation. So the natural wine movement is very deeply and rightfully connected with the worlds of organic and biodynamic farming. Obviously, there are many people in the natural space, maybe a little bit radical, a little bit counterculture. They decide not to get organic certification or whatever. That's a different problem that we could talk about later, maybe. I made this slide, but I talked about the idea that the natural wine movement has broadened a lot in its scope, and I wanted to try and illustrate that. So I tried to list everything here that I think shows you how a low intervention, a natural winemaker is thinking, perhaps, because it really does extend to every aspect of vineyard work and everything that you might consider doing or not doing in the cellar. So I think all of these are points on a curve. None of these are necessarily black and white. Some of these things are contentious as well. If we talk about machine harvesting or hand harvesting, there's a lot of discussion about whether machine harvesting is really as bad as some people say it is. I'm going to try and not get too bogged down in that discussion, but it's something to think about. I think that it's interesting for me, having visited hundreds of winemakers on both sides of this spectrum over the years. It's interesting to see how if there is such a thing as an archetypal natural winemaker, the way that they tend to think about their vineyard work is different. This idea of doing less, of intervening less, of trying to gently guide nature rather than force it into the template that you want is very important, and it runs through the whole process. We've already talked about some contentious things, but why? I'm still sometimes shocked, even today, at the amount of aggression, vitriol, even hatred that I come up against when we start talking about natural wine, or we use this phrase. And why is this? So I collect headlines. Every 3 or 4 years, there's a new one of these crops up somewhere along the lines. Someone decides to stick the boot in and have a go at poor little natural wine. And it's interesting to see what they focus on. I mean, Robert Parker famously said that natural wine will be exposed as a fraud a few years ago. His point was that it's unregulated. The term is meaningless because anyone can say they're making natural wine and there are no checks and balances. I refute that. There are lots of quite stringent grower organizations these days, and I'll talk about some of them in a second, but that was his point. I think there are 2 other main threads that I see that people like to have a go at. I do have to say, when I read articles like Troy Patterson's or Bruce Piling's, a lot of it sounds to me a little bit like, there's this new thing that's come along and I don't understand it, so I'm going to trash it. Because if I don't understand it, it must be bad. I wish it wasn't like this, but I think it's easy to get trapped into this way of thinking. If you're a classic wine drinker, maybe even a wine professional, but if you're used to a certain profile of the wines that you write about or that you enjoy drinking or whatever it might be, something comes along that feels a bit avant-garde, it feels a bit different, it's much easier to say, well, this is a load of rubbish. That's the easiest thing to say than to actually really take a step back and try to understand it. And I think what's important is that the wine world by the 1990s, early 2000s had got used to a very kind of correct, clean style of winemaking that relies a lot on technology and additives. But to me, it doesn't mean that that's the only way we can make wine. It doesn't mean that that's how all wine has to taste. But I think many of these vitriolic articles take that tone, and they're usually written by people who are not wine writers. They're usually written by people who have no connection to the trade. And to me, all they're doing is they're saying, well, this is new and weird and we don't understand it, so it's shit. Very dangerous approach, and not one that I recommend. I think obviously there's been a lot of talk over the years about, these wines are disgusting. And again, I read various things into that. One is this, well, they're just different, that's all. They're not what you expected, but that doesn't make them bad. But I think the other part of it is natural wine definitely had a boom. It had a point where it suddenly began to explode in popularity. Inevitably, we've had moments when the market's been flooded with examples that maybe are less than perfect. I have met countless enthusiastic young things over the years. You meet a young couple in their 20s and say, oh, we've decided to buy a vineyard and go and make wine. And I say, oh, that's great. How did you learn to make wine? And they say, oh, we're just going to learn by doing, but we're going to farm organically. We're not going to use any sulfites. And then you taste what they've done. And you're like, yeah, really should at least go and knock on the doors of some winemakers who've got some skills. I think this is another misconception. Making wine with your hands off, making wine without additives is really, really hard. It's a whole lot easier as a winemaker to add all of the yeasts and the sulfites and everything else. It's much, much easier. You get to sleep at night. You don't worry about what nature's got in store for you. It actually takes real skill and experience to make fantastic natural wine. And I think that was something that maybe got forgotten for a few years. There have definitely been some questionable wines put up for sale. And so I think this goes some way to explaining why we've seen so many of these kind of slightly vitriolic headlines. I did mention that a key concern that a lot of people have is they say, well, it's not legalized, it's not regulated, it's meaningless, it doesn't mean anything. There are so many organizations that have sprung up to try and plug this gap. I mentioned Raw Wine already. As I said, that's a series of wine fairs that takes place every year. I'm going to show you their charter in a second. Van Method Nature is very interesting. That's a voluntary labeling system that was created in France by a group of winemakers, I think 3 or 4 years ago now. It's a labeling scheme that's available to anyone in Europe, if not beyond. And it has two formats. There's a label that says you're making wine with up to 30 milligrams per litre of added sulfites, and there's a version that says you're making wine with no added sulfites. So I think it offers quite a bit of transparency. Obviously it's voluntary, a winemaker has to apply for it. There are supposed to be random checks, but I think they say they're only going to check about 10% of their applicants per year. But it's a start. It's a start in the right direction. Van Nature is a really interesting organization based in Italy. They have about 200 winemaker members. What I find interesting about Van Nature is they are the exact opposite of what you might think a bunch of natural winemakers might be. I think there's a view in the more traditional corners of the wine industry that natural winemakers are Luddites, that they reject the learning of the modern age. And this couldn't be less true when you meet a group of people like Vin Nature. They embrace science. They have a number of research projects running at the moment. They're all about basically applying science and knowledge to allow their members to make even better natural wine than they're already making. So I think there are so many winemakers out there who they're very open to a scientific approach, a knowledge-based approach. But underpinning all of that is still this philosophy that you can make better wine, you can make more expressive wine with a truer sense of place if you add less, if you add nothing, if you try to take your hands away and intervene as little as possible. There's so many other grower associations, wine fairs and so on that I could talk about. All of these associations have some kind of rule book, manifesto, regulation if you want to join, if you want to be part of it. I find the Raw Wine Charter quite useful. I think this captures all the important points, and they're all things that I've talked about already. Key things that we're talking about, organic or biodynamically farmed grapes. Raw Wine stance is that if you're not certified organic or biodynamic, then they will do their own background checks and see if you're really doing what you say you're doing. They require hand harvesting. As I said, that's contentious. Obviously, no added yeast, enzymes, any other funny stuff. Raw allows up to 50 milligrams per litre of total sulfites. Some people would say that's very high. It's still only 1/3 of what you're allowed to add under EU regulations for white wines. So it's still pretty low, really. No blocked malolactic fermentation. That's considered to be quite interventionist, and no other heavy manipulation, so taking out alcohol, reverse osmosis, things like that are barred. No sterile filtration. Raw does tolerate coarse filtration, in fact, under certain conditions, and of course no pasteurization. So this is their charter. There are a million different versions. It's a bit frustrating sometimes. Every natural wine fair, every natural wine association has variants on this. It would be lovely if governments or the EU stepped in and came up with something cast iron, but I think it's almost impossible now. The horse has bolted on that one. But I do find it interesting that there are so many winemakers worldwide who want regulation. You know, they want to be able to prove to. In fact, the whole way that they think is completely opposite to what some of these articles would lead you to suspect. Let's move on to taste. You know, we've talked a lot about philosophy and contention and things like that, but I mean, what are we really talking about? You know, if natural wine is a philosophy, can we reduce it to some points of difference? I think there's some very general things that we can say. I think with white wine in particular, there are two massive points of difference. I think it's very clear, obviously, when a white wine hasn't been filtered. The example in this picture is, as you can see, it's lightly hazy, but you might come across examples that are proudly and defiantly cloudy. I have never seen this to be a problem. It frustrates me hugely how much emphasis is put on the aesthetics of wine. I don't understand why this should be important. To me, it's about how it tastes, not how it looks. I think there's a need for more education here, because I know that the average wine consumer is often quite bothered if they see something cloudy, you know, because they've been taught, there's a whole industry out there that has taught them that hazy is somehow bad. I don't understand how we've ended up here. You know, we've got past this point in beer. You know, if you go to a craft beer venue, you know, craft beer lovers love cloudy New England IPAs. There's lots of other unfiltered, unpasteurized styles of beer. So I hope that we'll get to the same point in wine where this bizarre idea that the wine has to be star bright and beautifully clear, come what may, you know, however much work you have to do on it. I hope that will cease to be as important as it still seems to be. For me, when I see a wine and I can see that it's a bit hazy, I'm happy because I know that I'm getting more flavour. And, you know, why wouldn't you want that? You can't filter a wine to any level without losing some flavour and aroma compounds. I'd rather have the flavour and aroma compounds, personally. I think the other big difference with white wines made in a natural way, in maybe low intervention, is more often than not, you're going to have some or full malolactic fermentation. You know, the philosophy of a natural winemaker is that if nature wants the wine to go through mallow, you let it go through mallow. And I think that's obviously a key difference. You definitely encounter many styles that are a little bit more full-bodied, perhaps a little bit more tertiary herbal flavours, things like that. So I think these are two very general points that we could focus on. Obviously, orange wine is one of the biggest points of difference. You know, this is very much a heritage tradition of making wine that was largely forgotten in the post-World War II technological age of winemaking. It's become a bit of a poster child, a bit of a cause célèbre for natural winemakers. And there is clearly a bigger point of difference here. You know, everything about orange wine is different to the conventional idea of white wine: the colour, the flavour, the aroma, the texture. So I think this is very easy to latch on to. I think it's important just to say that when we talk about orange wine, you know, let's not conflate this with natural wine. Orange wine, for me, is just defined as a white wine made from fermented grapes. There is no philosophical statement in the category orange wine. It's describing a winemaking technique just the same as white wine, rosé wine, red wine are describing winemaking techniques. To that end, I think it's also important to bear in mind that, you know, obviously orange and natural get conflated all the time. They're not the same thing. Not all orange wines are natural wines. Not all natural wines are orange wines, obviously. Orange wine technique, natural wine philosophy. One thing I see more and more is major producers deciding to try making an orange wine. There are more and more orange wines appearing in supermarkets these days. Most, I think, would not meet the natural wine consumer's specification. Some would, but most wouldn't. So that's why I made this little Venn diagram, just to get this point across. You know, that orange and natural they're two concepts that may overlap, but they're not the same in any shape or form. I think red wine, it's sort of the one that almost gets a free pass, really, because even in the mainstream wine world, we're much more used to having unfiltered wines. Even if you're a drinker that likes classic Bordeaux and things like that, you're probably even used to wine that throws some sediment. So I think red wines made in a very low intervention way have the smallest point of difference with conventionally made red wines. Obviously, unfiltered wines are much more common. I think the other key thing is that in general, what I've seen is that winemakers who might identify as natural, minimal intervention or whatever, they tend to be far less enthusiastic about oak influence. This idea that we're going to age oak and we're going to overtly go for flavour coming from the barrels isn't really a thing in the natural wine world. There is this idea that it really should be about the grapes and the sense of place as much as possible, and anything that's going to exert undue influence on that is a bad thing. We've mentioned sulfites, and I always used to wonder why sulfites was such a hot potato in the natural wine world. I always thought that it's weird that people get so obsessed about this. But then, of course, I went back and looked at the history, and I realised, well, that's where this movement started. It started with Chauvet and Neuport focusing on no added yeast, no enzymes, no added sulfites. And so I think somehow it's like a chip on the shoulder that just won't go away. Obviously, sulfites are a phenomenally useful panacea if you're a winemaker. It prevents against oxidation, it kills bacteria, it can help your wine be less hazy. It's easy to see why it's become so popular. It's a cure-all when you're a winemaker. But it comes at a cost, and I liken wines made with a large amount of added sulfites, I liken it a bit to a person that's had a bit too much work done. It's someone that's had a facelift. And you're frozen in time, because that's what sulfites do. They freeze frame a wine. And here I go back to Isabelle Legeron's wording. And I think a wine with a high level of sulfites is no longer a living wine. There's no bacteria left in it. It can't change or express itself in quite the same way. Of course, it's a great way to make something that's very clean and stable, but it's no longer living wine. And I think personally, living wine is more interesting. Just as cheeses made from raw milk tend to be the most flavorful, they tend to be the most interesting, or bread made from a sourdough starter. So many of these foods that we fetishize and have become so popular today, they're all living things. They're all swimming in bacteria, and I think natural wine is too, and that's a good thing. That's what makes it interesting. That's what makes it change and evolve. That's what can make it come alive in your glass. So I understand why winemakers sometimes obsess about reducing sulfite additions to almost nothing or even nothing. I understand this goal, really. It's the last bastion. It's the last additive that you try to see if you can do without. And I've certainly had this experience. I've fallen in love with wines where the fruit was vivid and alive to an extent that I would never have believed possible. So I think when a winemaker gets it right, when they know that their fruit is healthy enough, when they know that their pH is low enough, working without sulfites can be extraordinary. The problem is it's a high-risk game. If you're not skilled and experienced with it, if your fruit is anything less than perfectly healthy, then there are problems that can occur. And that brings me on to faults. I think the thing about faults that really frustrates me is that I don't know if this is the fault of modern wine education or what, but I think many of us have been taught that faults are binary, that they're black or white. Either the wine is faulty or it's not faulty. I think that's the case with TCA. A wine is either corked or it isn't. But when we talk about a lot of other aspects that might be seen as faults, it's nothing like that simple to me. And the clearest demonstration, I think, is Brettanomyces. I mean, which of us at some point has not enjoyed an older vintage of Chateau Moussard or a red Bordeaux from a more classical producer, where there's a bit of Brett in there, but it's delicious. It's adding complexity. It's just rounding things out. The problem with Brettanomyces is if it takes over, if it becomes out of balance, if it overawes the fruit, and all you're tasting is cow shit, then yeah, that's not good. We're not talking about terroir anymore. We're just talking about rogue yeasts. But I think Brettanomyces in balance can be a beautiful thing. There's a reason why beer brewers love it so much, and obviously you have sour beers which are specifically brewed with Brettanomyces, and then you get all these lovely floral notes that Brettanomyces can also create. I sometimes find that those characters in some orange wines too. So again, I would encourage you to think about this as it's a curve, and the question is when is it too much? When is it in balance, and when is it delicious, and when has it crossed over and just become something feral and unharmonious? A little bit the same with volatile acidity, in my opinion. A wine with 0.0 grams of volatile acidity is the dullest thing on earth. Volatile acidity can make a wine come alive. It can lift the nose. It can generate a huge amount of excitement. But it can also become too much if you're just smelling nail polish remover. I'm not advocating for that. The problem is, again, these things are personal. So it really frustrates me when someone, they'll identify that there's a bit of volatile acidity, or they'll identify that there's a bit of Brettanomyces, and that means you have to slam the wine down and say it's faulty. I don't agree with this. For me, the only acid test for a wine, sorry, every pun intended, is, is this wine delicious? Am I enjoying it? Does it have a sense of balance and harmony? And that, to me, is the only important question. Same goes for oxidation in many ways. I think even in the conventional wine world, controlled oxidation, the kind of oxidation that you get if a wine has been in a barrel for 2 years, it can be part of the style. It can really work, or it can be too much. I think the only thing that for me is a little bit more clear-cut is mousiness. I'm going to go through this very briefly because I think it's important. I think mousiness is still very badly understood. Mousiness is a taint that's created by 3 compounds in the presence of lactic acid bacteria. You find it in wine with very low levels of free sulfites. So that's why it's become a thing in the modern day and age where we have more winemakers working without added sulfites. It needs a highish pH, it needs a little bit of warmth and oxygen, and then you have a risk that these compounds might get created in the wine. The huge problem with mousiness is that you can't smell it. It's not volatile until it hits your saliva, and then you get this disgusting aftertaste in your mouth 10 seconds after you've taken a sip. I hate mousiness. It frustrates me. When I encounter it, it makes the bottle undrinkable for me, and I wish the winemaker had added maybe 10 ppms of sulfites, because that would have been enough to fix it. But again, I go back to what I was talking about with sulfites before. I understand, winemakers obsess about how close they can get to this goal of really making wine with nothing added. I understand the obsession, even if it occasionally frustrates me. I'm running out of time, and I want to leave plenty of time for your questions. So these are all the main things I wanted to say. I think it's important to remember that natural wine is a philosophy. It's not a style or a taste or a single technique. It's a philosophy of trying to get back to nature, of trying to get closer to the idea of just letting the grapes express themselves, just letting nature express whatever happened in the vineyard that year. That, for me, is what it should be at its core, and it makes for some really exciting wines. As I say, I did make a list of a few producers that I would consider iconic. I'm not going to go through them now, but I will circulate. Oh, sorry, I missed something. I will circulate the slides in case anyone's interested in doing a bit of exploring. Sorry, I forgot to talk about these misconceptions. I think these are.
Got a moment or two. Please go on, Simon. Do please say.
Sorry.
Please continue.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So just some other misconceptions very briefly. I mean, things I hear a lot. I hear the idea that natural wines are fragile. I think this is a misconception because think about processed food. The more processed food is, the quicker it will spoil. If you think about meat, I hope there aren't too many vegetarians here, but if you take an entire piece of meat, it'll keep for a week in your fridge. As soon as you chop it up and start processing it and add things to it, then it becomes fragile. I don't think wine is any different, actually. If you make wine with the minimal possible intervention and additives, if you don't aggressively filter it or clarify it, The wine has inherent strength. It'll probably have some polyphenols. It'll have everything it needs to age and become stable. It might take time. It might take a year in a bottle before it gets there. But natural wines, in my experience, become incredibly stable given time. There's no reason a natural wine should oxidize if it's been well made. And nature has plenty of inbuilt protection in the form of acidity. If you don't harvest too late, if you keep your pH nice and low, there's no reason for your wine to oxidize. Orange wine is a great idea though if you're working with white grapes, because then you do have this added strength of a little bit of tannins and polyphenols. I think in terms of aging, I mean, I've had so many natural wines. I've had so many wines made with nothing added, not even sulfites, at 15, 20 years old. And they're some of the most delicious things I've ever drunk. So this to me is a myth. I think it's maybe a myth put around by major producers that are scared to go deeper into this approach. But it's just that, it's a myth. And I think this idea that all natural wines taste the same it's also a myth, because we're only talking about philosophy here. You can make a tannic structured big red wine or a light glue red. You can make them both in a natural way. I think the market has maybe coalesced around certain styles. There's a lot of glue reds, a lot of super lightweight kind of carbonic maceration reds out there, but this is to do with market taste. There's nothing inherent in the idea of natural wine, I don't think. There's much more that I could say about this, but let's move on. So yeah, as I said, I have a list of some countries and some winemakers that anyone who wants a bit of inspiration or wants to see who I rate, I'll circulate these slides for anyone who wants them later. But what I would propose to do now is see if anyone has any questions, and in case I forget after the questions, encourage you to contact me at any point and do go and check out my blog where I'm writing about this subject every single week. Thank you.
Simon, thank you so very, very much indeed. That was such a tour de force that you, by and large, reduced this lot to silence, stunned silence of admiration.
Oh, no question.
Not entirely. There are some questions coming up. I'd like to ask Wink. You have a question about alcohol. Can you hear me, Wink? Could you like to unmute yourself and?
Yeah. Hi, Simon. That was just such a concise and supremely well expressed presentation. Congratulations. So my question on alcohol is, I just wondered when you were talking about natural wine styles, whether, if one can generalize, natural wines have somewhat lower alcohol than their colleagues, should we say, in the same country, appellation, region, grape, etc. And what do you think of that? Or is that just my perception from the regions I know?
I think we can definitely say that there is a sort of theme, there is a preference in the natural wine community for lower alcohol. I think there is this idea, which maybe oughtn't to be, which maybe doesn't sit well in our age of abstinence, but there is this idea that wine is for drinking. And if you can make a wine with 11 or 12% alcohol, then you can drink more. And I think that's been a sort of, a point to think about in the natural wine world. I think in general as well, there's been a bit of refuting of the Parker idea, the long hang time idea. There's been a pushback on that coming from the natural wine community, that actually what we should be looking for in wine is freshness and lightness, and that wonderful French word digestible, and that those are the things to look for, not overbearing heavy wines where you have one glass and then you're done for the night. So yes, I think it is a philosophical preference. That said, I think it depends very much where you're making wine, and I've certainly had my fair share of high alcohol wines made by people who would identify as natural.
Okay, great. Do I have a right for a second question then?
You do. Please, Wink.
Well, it's more complicated, but you ran through four, I think, major faults that are thought about and considered. But isn't the biggest problem the overlap and the fact that you might have a wine that might have a certain amount of Brett, but also might have a certain amount of volatility and might even have a certain amount of oxidation. And that I'm going to leave the mousiness to one side. But if you've got those three problems at perhaps moderate level, but if they all come together, does that not give the taste that some drinkers, perhaps the older, more experienced drinkers, just go, I just don't like this?
I think it certainly can, but I think it's one of the things I've learned over the years is that I've definitely tasted wines that don't make any sense if you look at them from an analytical point of view. And I can remember one of the first times I had it's a rather iconic orange wine from a winery called La Stoppa, and the wine is called Agena. It's a wine that for me flirts with all the things that you just described. Maybe not oxidation, but it's definitely flirts with Brett and volatility. And I remember the first time I encountered this, I thought, my goodness, my WSET tutors better not be watching over me now. But I couldn't stop drinking it. It was delicious. It had a kind of, a sort of rustic charm that made me want to drink it. And I think that's a good thing. I think that, the biggest disservice you can do to wine is wanting it to conform to a formula, wanting it to conform to everything you've tasted before. I think the only question should be, do I want another glass?
Yeah.
And that doesn't come, and I can't tell that from looking at numbers, and I can say, yes, there clearly is VA and there clearly is Brett here, but they're working together and they're working with whatever else is going on, and I like it. Equally, I could get something that just tastes cidery and sour and it's disgusting, but I mean, that's the magic of wine. It's I think however far you try to quantify it, it's not always possible.
I think I asked the question not because of the analytics, but because of my own personal taste. And that is sometimes I confront a winemaker and say, I confront them politely and I say, look, I'm really sorry. I have a really low tolerance for volatile and I don't like this. And they go, but the volatile is really low. So then I feel like an idiot. And then I realize that I have learnt to realize that it is that combination that is obviously getting to me as well. And so I don't think it's necessarily always about figures. It's sometimes about personal tolerances and personal taste.
Totally agree. Yeah. I think it's such a personal thing, and that's why it frustrates me when someone says this wine is faulty. And I was like, well, maybe it's faulty for you, but it's not faulty for me. It's delicious. And I wish people wouldn't be quite so dogmatic one way or the other.
Yeah. Thanks.
I think a lot of it is about expectation, isn't it? And if people expect wine to taste in a particular kind of way, when it tastes different, that's a difficult challenge on occasions. And because a lot of natural wine doesn't taste like people's expectations, then finding the deliciousness in it becomes almost a philosophical issue. I mean, I've found that with wine professionals.
I think it's exposure as well, actually, and I think that's a big part of it. I mean, I encourage everyone to think about the sort of revolution in bread making that I think we've all seen in our lifetimes. And I don't know if anyone can remember the first time they had a properly sourdough loaf. And it can be an assault on the senses, and you have to decide, is this a style of bread that I enjoy or not? But some of us will go back and try it again and again and again, and then we'll decide, actually, this is delicious. It's far more interesting and complex than normal white sliced bread. And others will say, no, this is not for me. It's not working for me. And I think it's a little bit...
I make sourdough bread. I've made my own sourdough bread for nearly 10 years. Sometimes it's delicious and sometimes it isn't. And we have to be honest about the times when it isn't, when it doesn't work.
Yeah. But I think my point is just
question.
I think my point is that, if you let nature have the biggest hand, then it can surprise you and challenge you sometimes. And it just depends.
One very quick technical question. I'm a little bit puzzled why it's not thought right to do temperature control. I'm old enough to remember how the introduction of temperature control transformed the quality of many wines made here in southwest France. Why are makers of natural wine nervous about temperature control?
So I think it's important to know that there are relative levels here. There are very radical natural winemakers out there, the sort of people who refuse to add sulfites come what may, and they'd rather put a mousy bottle of wine up for sale than add anything. And they're probably the ones that are going to say, I will never temperature control my fermentation, even if my whites are fermenting at 35 Celsius. I think in general, though, the slightly more reasonable line is that what people don't want to do, they don't want to overtly change the temperature, particularly, for example, with white wines. Obviously, if you ferment white wine at, I don't know, 12 Celsius or something ridiculous like that, or even a bit higher, then you get these kind of very boiled sweet type flavors. You get this very estery character. There's nothing, that's not terroir wine. So I think what people are seeking to avoid is drastic temperature change. They're seeking to not follow a formula, because I've seen formulas from cooperative wine cellars in different parts of the world where they say, this is your formula. When the grapes come in, you add this, then you ferment with this yeast, you ferment at this temperature. And that's what you're supposed to do. And sometimes it takes a winemaker to step back and say, well, why do we have to do it like this? I don't think it has to ferment at 16 Celsius. It's actually perfectly fine if I let it go to 25, So I think many winemakers I know would step in with a gentle form of temperature control, cooling rods or something, if it's clearly getting out of control. If it's a heat wave year, if the cellar doesn't have adequate cooling, then yes, you might take it down a notch. But what they're not seeking to do is to go for that formula and say, well, this yeast is going to perform better, and we're going to get more of those, estery fresh fruit flavors if we take it right down to a very low temperature.
Thank you. I wish we could go on for much longer, but our hour is over. Thank you so much. I've got loads of messages I've been seeing which simply are expressions of awe and wonder and thanks that you have expressed things in such a wonderfully clear, concise way, and we are deeply grateful. Thank you very much, and good night, everybody.